The call came at 3:12 a.m. I was still awake. Men like me don't sleep. We wait. There's a difference. Sleep means you trust the dark. I stopped trusting anything the night I told Angela to leave and watched her walk out of my life without a single argument, like she'd been waiting for permission to go. My name is Ethan Voss. In certain rooms, in certain cities, that name functions like a loaded gun. People hear it and go very, very still. I had built that reputation brick by brick, threat by threat, over 15 years. I was not a man who trembled. Then my phone lit up, and the voice on the other end was Angela's. Fractured, distant, drowning in something I didn't recognize until I heard the monitor beeping behind her like a countdown. "Ethan, I need you. Room 4, please." That was all she said. 3 sentences. No accusation, no explanation. Just my name, spoken like it was the last word she had left. I was in my car before she finished the second one. I drove like the city owed me a debt, cutting through 4 red lights in a tunnel at 90 miles an hour, my security detail scrambling behind me in 2 black SUVs they could barely keep in sight. My second in command, Dante, called twice. I didn't answer. I had no words for what was happening inside my chest. It felt structural, like a load-bearing wall had just cracked. Mercy General Private Maternity Ward smelled like antiseptic and forced calm. The fluorescent lights were the color of surrender. My boots hit the polished floor and the sound carried. Every nurse at the station looked up, and I watched the recognition move across their faces like a cold front rolling in. I did not slow down. I was almost at room 4 when I heard it. A sound I had never heard before in my life. Small, furious, impossibly alive. A baby's first cry. My hand found the doorframe. My legs that had carried me through firefights, through backroom executions, through 15 years of war, stopped moving entirely. And for the first time since I was 7 years old, standing over my father's grave, Ethan Voss did not know what to do next. I pushed open the door. Angela was propped against the hospital pillow, her curls damp and flattened against her neck, her skin carrying the gray exhaustion of someone who had just fought a war no one else could see. An IV line ran into the back of her left hand. Her hospital gown was twisted at the shoulder. She looked smaller than I remembered, and I remembered everything about her. The exact way she stood in my kitchen at 2 in the morning. The way she laughed like she was trying to keep it quiet. She looked at me the way you look at something you stopped letting yourself hope for. "You came," she said. Not an accusation. Not relief. Just the fact of it landing soft. Angela. Her name came out wrong. Too rough, like I dragged it up from somewhere I hadn't opened in months. I crossed the room in 4 steps and took her hand before I decided to. Her fingers closed around mine immediately, like a reflex, like muscle memory. Like they'd been waiting. I should have said something. I am a man who has negotiated across tables where the wrong word costs lives. I have never struggled to speak, but standing in that room, under those white lights, holding Angela's hand while she looked up at me with something I did not deserve, I had nothing. Then the nurse moved. It was a small shift, barely 3 feet to the left, and she turned toward me with her arms adjusted, and I saw the bundle she was carrying. White cotton, a hospital cap the size of my fist, and a face so new it barely seemed real. My daughter looked up at nothing in particular with the slightly stunned expression of someone who had just arrived somewhere unexpected. Her eyes were barely open. Dark. The exact shape of mine. The exact shape of mine. The room did something strange then. The monitor's beeping pulled back, the fluorescent hum disappeared, and for approximately 4 seconds, nothing in my life prior to that moment mattered at all. Not the empire. Not the enemies. Not the carefully constructed walls I had spent 15 years building around everything soft inside me. She was 8 pounds of irrefutable evidence that I had already lost. "Ethan," Angela's voice, gentle, pulling, "She has your eyes." "I know." It came out barely above a whisper. "Are you going to be okay?" I looked at my daughter. I looked at the woman I had sent away to keep her safe, who had carried this alone for 9 months without a single word of complaint, who had still called me when it mattered. I was not okay. I was the furthest thing from okay. I was a man who controlled entire cities, and I was completely, catastrophically undone by 7 pounds of sleeping newborn and one woman who still trusted me against every reasonable argument. "No," I said, "but I will be." I meant it like a vow. The monitor flickered. It was a small thing, half a second of interference, the numbers ghosting before snapping back, but I noticed it the way I notice everything that doesn't belong. I had been sitting at the edge of Angela's bed, my daughter asleep in the bassinet 3 feet away, and the room had almost convinced me it was safe. Almost. My earpiece crackled. "Boss!" Dante's voice, low and clipped. He only used that tone when the news was bad and the window to act was closing. "We have movement. Parking garage sub-level 2. 4 vehicles, no plates. They're not hospital staff." I was on my feet before he finished the sentence. Angela read my face instantly. She always could, which was one of the reasons I had told her to leave. Her eyes sharpened, the exhaustion pulled back, replaced by something older and warier. "What's happening?" "Nothing you need to worry about right now. Ethan?" "Angela." I kept my voice even. "I need you to trust me for the next 20 minutes. Can you do that?" She looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked at our daughter. "Yes," she said. "But you better not disappear on me again." I didn't answer that. I moved to the door. The ward was already wrong. I felt it before I saw it. A specific quality of silence had settled over the hallway, the kind that happens when people with training stop pretending to be ordinary. 2 of my men had taken positions at the corridor junctions, and I could see from their posture alone that the situation was escalating faster than I liked. Dante met me at the nurse's station, his jaw tight. "They're splitting. One team heading for the stairwell on the east side, one moving through the service corridor. Whoever planned this knew our entry points." That detail landed like a stone in still water. I let the ripples move outward without letting my expression change. "How many people knew we were coming here tonight?" "Inner circle only. 6 people. 6 people. One of them had made a phone call they weren't supposed to make, and now armed men were moving through a maternity ward while my newborn daughter slept 8 feet from the door. "Lock down this floor," I said. "Get Angela and the baby to the interior room at the end of the hall. No windows, single entry point, and call Marco. Tell him to have the ambulance ready at the loading dock in 10 minutes. We're moving her tonight?" She just delivered. "They already know room 4, Dante." I turned back toward the door, my voice dropping to a register I reserved for situations without good options. "They knew before I got here." The monitor in Angela's room beeped steadily through the wall, patient and indifferent. The most dangerous sound in the building. My daughter was 11 minutes old, and someone had already decided she was leverage. I was not going to let that stand. The interior room was smaller, colder, and smelled more aggressively of disinfectant. Angela sat upright in the new bed with our daughter pressed against her chest, and she watched me the way she always had, like she was reading something written underneath my expression that I hadn't meant to leave there. My men had neutralized the immediate threat. 2 of the 4 vehicles had retreated when they realized the floor was locked down. The other 2 were being handled. The situation was contained, for now, in the way a fire is contained when you've only managed to wet the edges. I pulled the chair close and sat. Not pacing, not issuing orders, just sitting because Angela deserved that much, and because I had learned years ago that she would not talk to a man who was still moving. "I need to understand," I said quietly. "Why didn't you tell me?" She looked down at the baby for a long moment. Her hand moved in slow circles across the white cotton blanket, automatic and tender. "Because I knew what would happen," she said finally. "The same thing that just happened. Armed men in a parking garage, lockdowns, my daughter born into a world where her first night alive includes a security sweep." "Angela, I'm not angry at you, Ethan," she said it gently, which was somehow harder to absorb than anger would have been. "I want you to understand that. I made a decision, and I knew it would hurt you, and I made it anyway because I couldn't see another way. You could have told me. I would have." "What?" She looked at me directly then. "What would you have done? Stepped away from the Empire overnight? Moved us somewhere safe?" There was no cruelty in the question. just the steady weight of someone who had already worked through every version of this conversation, alone in the dark for 9 months. I grew up watching my mother love a man who lived between two worlds. She spent 20 years waiting for the day the wrong world won. I wasn't going to do that to her. She glanced down at our daughter, or to her. The room was very quiet. I wanted to tell her she was wrong. I wanted to argue the point, construct a counter-argument, find the flaw in her logic the way I found flaws in everything. That was what I did. That was the skill set 15 years had sharpened to a fine and brutal edge. But she wasn't wrong, and I was honest enough. At 4 a.m., in a locked hospital room with my newborn daughter breathing softly against her mother's chest, to admit it. I let you walk away, I said, because I thought distance would keep you safe. I know, Angela said. That's the part that broke me. Not that you didn't love me. That you did, and it still wasn't enough to make you choose differently. I had no answer for that. So I reached out and covered her hand with mine, and I left it there. And I let the silence hold what words couldn't. The loading dock smelled like diesel and cold air and the specific kind of urgency that has no room for second guessing. Dante had the ambulance back tight against the bay door, engine running, one of our medics already inside with a portable monitor and a neonatal kit he'd sourced from the hospital's supply room without asking permission. I had stopped apologizing for the things we took without asking a long time ago. Tonight, I was grateful for the habit. Angela walked because she refused not to. I had offered the wheelchair twice. She had declined twice, with the quiet, iron-spine politeness she used when she had already made up her mind and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. She carried our daughter pressed to her chest, one hand braced on my arm, and she moved through the service corridor like someone who understood exactly what was happening and had decided fear was not a useful response to it. I kept my hand at the small of her back. I told myself it was tactical. It wasn't. We were 40 seconds from the bay door when Dante's voice came through sharp in my ear. They repositioned. One vehicle coming around the north side of the building. ETA 90 seconds. Move faster, I said to no one and everyone. We cleared the bay door at a run. Angela's version of a run, 3 days postpartum, which was still faster than most people's best effort. And I filed that away as one more thing about her that undid me. I got her into the ambulance first, then the baby, then folded myself in behind them as Dante pulled the doors shut and slapped the side panel twice. The ambulance lurched forward. The first shot hit the rear panel 30 seconds later. A single metallic crack, high and wide, a warning or a miss, it didn't matter which. What mattered was that they had eyes on us, and they weren't stopping. Angela flinched at the sound but didn't make a noise. She tucked her body tighter around our daughter, instinctive and absolute, and I watched her do it and understood something I hadn't fully understood before. She had always been this. The woman who had stood in my kitchen at 2 in the morning and argued with me about the cost of the life I'd built, she had not been naive about the danger. She had simply been brave enough to name it when I wasn't. I reached across and put my hand over hers. "I've got you," I said. It was not a comfort. It was a statement of fact, a declaration, the closest thing to a promise I had made in 15 years. She looked at me in the dim blue light of the ambulance, our daughter breathing steadily between us, and she said, "I know. I called you, didn't I?" The second shot went wide. We were already gone. The mountain estate sat behind 3 perimeter walls and 6 years of careful silence. No one found it by accident. No one arrived uninvited. It was the one place in my world that had never been touched, and I had driven Angela and our daughter through its gates at 5 a.m. with the specific relief of a man who believed he had finally reached solid ground. By 9 a.m., I understood the ground was not solid. I was standing in the main corridor when it landed. Not a dramatic revelation, but a quiet one. The kind that arrives without announcement and simply waits for you to look directly at it. I was reviewing the night's timeline in my head, the way I reviewed everything, running each detail back against itself to find the seams. The men in the parking garage had arrived with precise knowledge of our entry point. They had known which floor. They had known which room. I had not called ahead to the hospital. I had told no one where I was going until I was already in the car, and even then I had used voice only, no messages, no digital record. I had kept the circle tight, the same 6 names I always used for sensitive movements. Inner circle only. I walked to the study and wrote those 6 names on a blank sheet of paper. Dante, Marco, Reyes, Chen, Sullivan, Voss. I looked at them for a long time. These were not strangers. These were men who had sat across tables from me, who had traveled with me, who had made decisions in the dark that they carried quietly and without complaint. Trust in my world was not sentiment. It was a working calculation, tested and retested over years. I did not extend it carelessly. Someone had spent it carelessly on my behalf. I began with what I knew. The timeline was narrow. The window between my departure and the arrival of those vehicles was under 40 minutes. That meant the call had gone out fast from someone who understood urgency. That narrowed the profile. This was not someone who had been turned gradually, over months, by patient pressure. This was someone who had made a decision quickly, which meant either desperation or a deal already in place, waiting to be activated. I pulled the movement logs from the previous 24 hours. Not surveillance, just the routine check-in protocol my men followed when operating in proximity to my location. Everyone accounted for, all timestamps clean, all positions verified, except one gap. Sullivan had signed off at 11:38 p.m. and back in at 12:04. 26 minutes. Enough time for a call. Enough time for coordinates to change hands. I noted it without reaction and set the paper down. Sullivan had been with me for 4 years. He was efficient, controlled, and had never given me a reason to look twice. That was, I now understood, exactly the kind of man you recruited when you wanted someone who wouldn't be looked at twice. I picked up my phone and called Dante. "I need eyes on Sullivan," I said. Quietly. "Don't let him know he's been found." I did not say yet. But we both heard it. The message arrived at noon, delivered through a channel that should not have existed. A burner number routed through 3 different relay points, landing on a phone only 4 people alive knew about. That alone told me everything I needed to know about who I was dealing with. The Renko family, Eastern Syndicate, 12 territories, a reputation for patience that most people in this business mistook for weakness until they were already surrounded. The message was brief. They usually were, when the sender believed they held all the cards. Vacate the North Corridor holdings by Friday. The woman and child remain unharmed. Refuse, and we finish what we started in the parking garage. I read it twice. Then I set the phone face down on the table and walked to the window that overlooked the estate's eastern garden. Angela was outside. She had insisted on fresh air, and the nurse had relented when Angela used the particular tone that apparently worked on medical professionals the same way it worked on me. She was moving slowly along the gravel path, our daughter bundled against her chest in a wrap the nurse had fashioned from a spare blanket. The morning light caught them both in a way that made something tighten behind my sternum. The North Corridor holdings represented 4 years of careful construction. Warehouses, transit routes, 3 legitimate front businesses that I had been quietly expanding into the foundation of something cleaner. Surrendering them wouldn't just cost me territory. It would cost me the exit I had been, without fully admitting it to myself, slowly building. I knew what the old version of me would have done. He would have sent 12 men and a message of his own, written in a language that required no translation. He would have ended the conversation before Friday by making Friday irrelevant. It would have been efficient. It would have been bloody. And it would have guaranteed that the Renko family's next move was aimed not at territory, but at the woman walking in my garden with my daughter pressed against her heart. Violence invites violence. I had always known that. I had simply never had a reason to care about the cycle before. I picked up a different phone. This one connected to a man named Carver. Not a soldier, not a fixer. A forensic accountant who had spent 11 years working financial crimes for the federal government before I had quietly tripled his salary and redirected his skill set. He knew more about the Renko family's financial architecture than the Renkos themselves. "I need everything," I told him. Wire transfers, shell structures, the offshore accounts they used for the Delman import contracts. All of it documented and packaged. "For what purpose?" Carver asked carefully. I'm going to hand it to someone who can make better use of it than I can, I said. There was a pause. That's a different play than usual. I have a different reason than usual, I said and ended the call. Through the window, Angela looked up and found me watching. She didn't wave. She just held my gaze for a moment, steady and certain, and that was enough. Carver delivered the package on Thursday morning. 43 pages of documented transactions, shell company registrations, and wire transfer records that painted a precise and damning portrait of the Renko family's financial infrastructure. 11 years of laundering, 3 federal jurisdictions, 2 sitting officials whose campaign contributions traced back to accounts that didn't officially exist. It was, in the language of consequence, a loaded gun. I did not pull the trigger myself. I had spent 2 days running through every version of the direct approach. The confrontation, the counterstrike, the kind of surgical operation that would have neutralized the Renko family's leadership within 72 hours and sent a message that would echo for years. I knew exactly how to do it. I had the men, the resources, and 15 years of practiced ruthlessness. But I kept coming back to a single image. My daughter, 4 days old, her fingers curled around nothing, breathing with the total trust of someone who had not yet learned that the world required defenses. I wanted her to stay that way as long as possible. And the version of me capable of ordering that strike was not the version of me capable of giving her that. So instead I made 3 phone calls. The first was to a federal prosecutor named Hargrove, who had been building a case against the Renko family for 6 years and hitting walls that were, I now understood, partially of my own construction. I did not introduce myself by name. I told him a secure package would arrive at his office by end of day, and that if he followed the Delman thread, he would find everything he needed. The second call was to Sullivan. Dante had found him at a rented apartment 40 miles from the estate, living on cash and the apparent belief that distance made him untouchable. I had listened to Dante's surveillance report without expression and spent one long night deciding what Sullivan deserved. What I wanted to do and what I was going to do were 2 very different things, and the distance between them was exactly the size of my daughter's sleeping face. Sullivan answered on the second ring. I told him to record the conversation. Then I gave him a choice, a full recorded confession delivered to Hargrove's office alongside Carver's package in exchange for relocation, a new identity, and his life. Or the alternative, which I did not need to specify. He chose correctly. People usually did, when the options were that clear. The third call was to the Renko family's intermediary. I told him that Hargrove's office had received a delivery, that the Friday deadline was therefore no longer a relevant piece of information, and that the North Corridor holdings would remain exactly where they were. There was a long silence on the other end. Then the line went dead. By Friday morning, the Renko family had other problems. Significant, federal, non-negotiable problems. The kind that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with 11 years of decisions they had made before I became a father. I walked into the East Wing, sat on the edge of Angela's bed, and let her sleep. My hands were clean. For the first time in 15 years, my hands were entirely clean. There were no guests. That had been Angela's condition, stated simply over breakfast 3 weeks after we arrived at the estate, while our daughter slept in the bassinet between us. And the morning came through the kitchen windows in long, quiet panels of light. She had looked at me over her coffee cup and said, "If we do this, I don't want an audience. I don't want flowers flown in or a reception or any of it. I just want you to mean it." I had said, "I've always meant it." She had said, "I know. That's why I'm still here." We were married on a Saturday in the estate's western garden by a civil officiant named Rosario, who asked no questions about why a ceremony this small required this much perimeter security. Dante stood 30 feet away with his back to us, which was his version of giving us privacy. The nurse held our daughter, who was asleep and therefore unbothered by the significance of the occasion. Angela wore a dress the color of winter light, not white, not ivory, something in between that caught the afternoon sun and held it. She had done her own hair. She was not carrying flowers. She was looking at me the way she always did when she had already decided something and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. I had prepared nothing to say. Every version I had rehearsed in the quiet hours before dawn had sounded like a man trying to be adequate to something that didn't have adequate language. So when Rosario nodded at me, I put it down plainly. "I sent you away because I thought love was something I was supposed to protect people from," I said. "I was wrong. I spent 9 months being wrong without knowing it, and you spent 9 months being braver than I deserved. I'm not going to be the man I was, not because I'm afraid of what that man costs me. I've never been afraid of cost, but because you showed me what the bill actually was, and I'm not willing to keep paying it." Angela's jaw tightened slightly, the way it did when she was holding something in. Her eyes were bright. "I'm not good at this," I said. "I know," she said quietly. "You're doing fine." Rosario read the short form of the declaration. We said what needed to be said. I put a ring on Angela's finger. Simple, white gold, nothing that announced itself. And she put one on mine with the steady hands of a woman who had already done the harder thing of deciding to trust me again. When it was done, the officiant stepped back, and Angela looked up at me with an expression I had no word for and didn't need one. Our daughter woke at that exact moment and made a small, indignant sound, as if registering a complaint about being excluded from the proceedings. Angela laughed. It was the best sound I had ever heard in my life, and I had been listening for it without knowing it for over a year. I took my daughter from the nurse and held her for the first time without fear, without the paralysis of understanding what I stood to lose. Just held her, in the western garden, in the afternoon light, with Angela's hand in mine. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. 5 years later, I watched my daughter try to catch a butterfly. She was serious about it. The way she was serious about most things, with her brow furrowed and her arms out and her whole small body committed to the project. The butterfly was not cooperating. It lifted away from the lavender at the last possible second every time, with an indifference that she found personally offensive. She made a sound of frustration and turned to find me watching, and her expression shifted immediately into the particular look she used when she wanted something and had already calculated the most effective approach. She had my eyes and Angela's instincts. I had no chance against her, and I had known it since she was 11 minutes old. "Again," she announced, and turned back to the garden. I sat on the stone bench at the edge of the lawn and let the afternoon do what it wanted. The estate was quieter now. Not the manufactured quiet of a building on lockdown, but the real kind, the kind that happens when the source of the noise is simply gone. Dante ran a private security consulting firm out of the East Wing office. Marco had retired to Geneva and sent photographs of his own grandchildren with a regularity that suggested he had found peace. Carver had been promoted twice within his new federal advisory role, a fact he communicated with exactly the kind of understated satisfaction that suited him. The North Corridor holdings were legitimate businesses now, fully converted, properly taxed, managed by people who had no idea what the buildings had been before. The process had taken 2 years and required more paperwork than anything I had done in the previous 15 combined. Angela had sat beside me through most of it, reading contracts, flagging language, applying the same steady attention to dismantling an empire that she had applied to surviving one. She appeared now in the doorway behind me, 2 cups of coffee, barefoot on the warm stone. She handed me one and sat close enough that her shoulder pressed against mine. "She's been at that butterfly for 20 minutes, Angela said. "She'll get it eventually. She gets everything eventually." We watched our daughter stalk through the lavender in silence for a moment, and I felt the particular quality of that silence. The one that had nothing left in it that needed to be said. I looked down at my hands wrapped around the coffee cup. I had looked at them 1,000 times over the past 5 years, half expecting to find something that wouldn't wash off. There was nothing. Just hands. Older now, a small scar on the left knuckle from a cabinet door I hadn't been paying attention to, a tan line from a watch Angela had given me for my birthday. Ordinary hands. A life built in them like something planted, taking root. Angela leaned her head against my shoulder. Our daughter laughed suddenly at something. The butterfly had landed on her sleeve finally, on its own terms. She stood completely still, barely breathing, afraid to lose it. I understood the feeling entirely.